Right, guys, in the previous lesson we talked about how to test a claim regarding a proportion of a population, and today we'll focus on how to test a claim that involves an average. Let's say if a study comes out and say the average American sleeps 8 hours a day, how do we know that for sure? So therefore we have to test that claim. If claim that comes out that says the amount of food consumed by an average American is 2 pounds per week, how do we know that for sure? Therefore we have to have a way to test that claim. Alright, so a lot of the technique that you learn in chapter 8 section 2 and 3 will be applied to this section. The only thing that's different is when you find your test statistic. That's the only thing that's going to be a bit different. Alright, but everything else remains the same. You set up a hypothesis test, you find the test statistic, you find the p-value afterward, and then you write a conclusion depending on how the p-value is to the significant level. Okay. Now there is a difference when we talk about the test statistic to test a claim involving an average. The formula for the test statistic is going to be t, the value, which can be found using x bar minus the mu, the population average, divided by s over the square root of n. We would use this test statistic if we don't know the population standard deviation. Okay. If we do know the population standard deviation, which is rarely, then we would slide over to using something like this. Okay, sigma goes here, and then the square root of n goes there. All right. If we ended up using this test statistic, then we would use the t-table distribution to identify a range for a p-value, okay? And if we use that, then we'll use the z-table distribution to identify a range for the p-value. So it will depend on which test statistic we're going to use, and that depends on whether or not we know the population standard deviation. Okay, we can find both of these using a calculator. So I'm going to write down the steps for you on how to use a calculator to find these values without doing it by hand. Testing it. So to find a calculator to find the p-value. If going back to this is in section 3 of chapter 8, if we're testing a claim about a proportion, about a percent of a population, then if you recall, I showed you this in your homework, in your classwork today, stats and tests, and then you select one prop z test, and then you enter the data. Okay. If we're testing claim about our mean, which is what we're doing today, and sigma is unknown, which means that we don't know the population standard deviation, then the calculator can be programmed by typing in the following steps. We're using t-tests, okay, and then you would enter the data. Okay, so similar to that t-test, this is what we're going to use. If our sigma is known, then we would program the calculators this way. Z-test, select Z-test, okay, and then you enter the data. I will show you how to complete one of these calculators on the next page. Okay, so a couple of things that's different, make sure you pay attention to this, If you don't know your population standard deviation, then use a t-distribution. If you do know your population standard deviation, then use a z-distribution. Okay, and then these are the calculator steps if you're allowed to use a calculator to find the p-value and draw a conclusion. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of examples. Say that a college professor suspects that students at his school are getting less than 8 hours of sleep per night on average. To test his belief, the professor asked a random sample of 28 students, and here are the data. So the claim is that the average amount of sleep is less than 8. Okay. Opposite of the claim is that the average amount of sleep is more than 8. So we use this to set up our hypothesis testing. So remember that the one with an equal sign, that's your null hypothesis. And your alternative is the opposite, which is less than 8. So we set up our hypothesis test. Now we're gonna find the test statistic, and we're gonna use the t-test. Use t-test because sigma is unknown. We don't know what sigma is. We don't know what the population standard deviation is. So therefore, we're going to use t-test. Remember that t can be found by using x bar minus the average divided by s over the square root of n. Now, to find x bar and s, you're going to start by entering this data into the calculator. To enter the data into the calculator, you push that, and then you hit enter, and that allows you to enter the data into the list, which I did already. I entered data into list 1. The next step is I'm going to calculate the average. Hit stat, and then select calculate, and then choose 1 bar, or just push enter. And then make sure it says L1 because we entered the data into L1. So if yours doesn't say L1, I want you to change that to L1 by hitting second and the number 1. And that reverts it to L1. Hit enter a few times, and then you have your x bar, which is about 6.46, and then your standard deviation, which is 1.99. So your x bar is 6.46, standard deviation is 1.99. Your sample size is 28 people because if you count the number of people in our sample is 28. Okay. And so now we're ready to plug these data into that to calculate the t. So make sure you do it slowly and carefully. So 6.46 is the value for x bar. Your mu is 8. Okay, so 8 goes in here. Your s is 1.99 divided by the square root of 28. So I punch those numbers in. 6.46 minus 8 divided by 1.99. Notice how I put parentheses, very important there. Divided by the square root of 28, close parentheses, and I get a t value of 4.09.